when the U.S. Department of Justice released over 3 million pages of materials tied to Jeffrey Epstein's investigations. It wasn't just another data dump. It was a seismic moment in public transparency. This massive release, mandated by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, included a vast array of documents, images, and videos that had remained sealed for years, opening an unprecedented window into Epstein's world of influence and association. For people around the world, this was the first time the public could access such a comprehensive dataset. Overnight, journalists, researchers, and ordinary citizens alike pored over files, screenshots, and redactions in a frantic search for names and connections that might finally reveal the reach of Epstein's network. Discussions about what these files might contain mushroomed into speculation, conspiracy, and intense debate about who was mentioned, who was left out, and what it all means. Headlines ranged from revelations about missing interview records to ongoing reviews of whether material was withheld improperly, including some linked to high-profile figures. Yet even as the world obsessed over individual names, a deeper truth began to surface. This story isn't only about celebrity or political association. It is about the structures that allowed Epstein to operate with near-total impunity for years. A sobering reminder that systems of power can protect those within them in ways that outlast any single arrest or conviction. Epstein's 2019 arrest on sex trafficking charges and subsequent death in custody, ruled a suicide, prevented him from ever standing trial and fully accounting for his actions in court. Maxwell, his longtime associate, was later convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in recruiting and grooming victims. Meanwhile, even after the monumental release of these files, questions remain about what has not been made public. Investigations in the U.S. Congress are underway into whether specific records were improperly withheld, particularly those involving unverified allegations of sexual abuse connected to Epstein. Legal and public scrutiny continue as lawmakers demand more transparency and victims' rights groups push for fuller disclosure. As the public grappled with the scope of this material, two Hollywood figures had already voiced discomfort with the entertainment industry's culture years earlier, not as a direct commentary on Epstein's case, but as a reflection of what they perceived to be deep-seated unease at the heart of power and influence. Mel Gibson, well known for his intense and often controversial body of work, spoke candidly about how disorienting Hollywood felt when he first arrived. He described the industry as a strange town where conversations abruptly stopped when he walked into a room, a telling metaphor for a world where unspoken rules and subtle pressures can shape careers and silence dissent. What made Gibson's experience especially emblematic was not just the discomfort he described, but what he chose to do with that feeling: challenge it. Gibson's fight wasn't subtle. When major studios repeatedly passed on The Passion of the Christ, a film he envisioned as a powerful expression of faith and redemption, he made the bold decision to finance and produce it himself. Directed by Gibson and released in 2004, The Passion of the Christ went on to become one of the highest-grossing independent films in American history, earning hundreds of millions worldwide despite polarizing reviews and controversy. The success of that film was more than a box office statistic. It was a rebuke to the prevailing belief in Hollywood that overtly spiritual and morally driven projects could not succeed commercially. The movie's massive financial and cultural impact demonstrated that there was a global audience hungry for storytelling rooted in conviction rather than conformity. It showed, too, that an artist willing to dissent from industry expectations could still shape culture, albeit at the cost of potential studio support and mainstream acceptance. Gibson's struggle, as he described it, was neither casual nor abstract. It was the lived experience of an artist who saw an industry that, in his eyes, often reacted defensively when confronted with material that challenged its norms, spiritually, culturally, or morally. That resistance, for him, was not just about one film or one decision. It was symbolic of a broader hesitancy within powerful creative institutions to fully embrace content that dared to stand outside the mainstream's comfort zone. A few years later, an entirely different cultural story unfolded with the release of Sound of Freedom, a 2023 film that dramatizes the true inspired efforts of a former U.S. government agent to rescue children from sex trafficking rings in Latin America. The film had been completed in 2018, but remained in distribution limbo for years after its initial distribution deal was disrupted by corporate changes at the studio that originally acquired it. Its producers eventually regained the rights and partnered with a faith-based distributor, Angel Studios, using crowdfunding and grassroots support to bring it to theaters in July 2023. On its release, Sound of Freedom defied expectations and became one of the most successful independent films of the year in the United States and Canada, grossing hundreds of millions at the box office and ranking among the top 10 films domestically, a rare achievement for a low-budget movie without traditional Hollywood backing. Audiences reacted strongly, giving the film exceptionally high viewer ratings and supporting it far beyond early media projections. Despite its financial success and enthusiastic audience response, some mainstream outlets characterized the film as politically motivated or aligned with particular cultural movements, and there was debate about whether its subject matter became entangled with broader political narratives. At the same time, many viewers and independent commentators praised it for drawing attention to the real issue of child trafficking, a global problem that persists far beyond any single film. This contrast between initial skepticism from parts of the media and the audience's overwhelmingly positive reception underscored a disconnect between how certain topics are treated in Hollywood and how they resonate with broader segments of the public. Mark Wahlberg's journey, by contrast, did not center on a single project but on a broader shift in life and priorities. In 2022, Wahlberg and his family moved away from Los Angeles to Nevada, a decision he publicly attributed to giving his children a better environment in which to grow and thrive. In interviews, he described the move as an opportunity for his children to pursue their interests in supportive communities outside the traditional entertainment hub, noting that areas near Las Vegas offered family-friendly neighborhoods that suited their lifestyle better. For Wahlberg, faith has long been a central part of public identity and personal narrative. He has spoken on numerous occasions about how his Christian beliefs have shaped his life, discipline, and perspective, including in interviews where he reflects on how devotion to God helped guide his decisions and growth. Rather than frame his decision purely as a reaction against Hollywood, Wahlberg has emphasized that his relocation and subsequent projects reflect a deliberate choice to align his professional life with his values, building work environments and content that resonate with his beliefs, and in some cases, creating new opportunities outside traditional studio systems. Both Gibson and Wahlberg, in their respective ways, experienced pushback or friction when they pursued paths that diverged from Hollywood's mainstream norms. They were not criticized for alleged wrongdoing, but they did face industry resistance when challenging established expectations, whether through the subject matter of their films or the direction of their careers. Their stories now echo with deeper resonance as the public continues to examine the vast trove of Epstein documents, which were released under the bipartisan Epstein Files Transparency Act and include millions of pages of records, emails, images, and videos related to investigations into Epstein and his confidants. The release represents a significant step toward transparency, but critics, including victims' advocates and some lawmakers, argue that extensive redactions and withheld material show there is still much that remains unseen. The broader question raised by these developments is not simply who appears in the Epstein files, but why resistance persists around certain narratives and truths. When individuals within powerful cultural industries treat some stories or topics as risky or career-limiting, it suggests deeper dynamics around how influence, image, and reputation are managed. Discussions about figures such as Oprah Winfrey, Harvey Weinstein, and others, whether tied to interpersonal controversies, legal cases, or public perception, reflect this larger conversation about accountability, influence, and how institutions handle claims of wrongdoing or uncomfortable truths. In many cases, critics argue that powerful networks have historically minimized public scrutiny of their inner workings, which only reinforces calls for greater transparency and systemic change as more documents and testimonies continue to surface. Even after millions of pages were published, significant controversy and unanswered questions remain about what was released and what was not. Although the Department of Justice announced it published around 3.5 million responsive pages under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, critics, including lawmakers from both parties, argue that the release was incomplete and heavily redacted, with many documents still not available to the public despite legal requirements. Members of Congress who helped pass the transparency law have publicly demanded explanations about why so much material remains obscured and why the original deadline was missed. Survivors and advocacy groups have also joined in the criticism, saying the partial disclosures and redactions undermine the purpose of the law and leave victims without full public accountability. Journalists and researchers reviewing the early releases found that faulty redaction practices made it possible in some cases to recover supposedly hidden content, including sensitive information that officials had intended to shield, which only added to the perception that the process was chaotic and inconsistent. Some observers have highlighted that the files released represent only a portion of what prosecutors had originally identified as potentially responsive to the statute, suggesting that millions more records remain withheld from public view despite the law's mandate. In other cases, lawmakers reviewing unredacted records privately have reported that some names were concealed without clear legal justification, until pressure from Capitol Hill led to additional unredactions. This dynamic, where documents are technically published yet still appear incomplete, obscured, or delayed, fuels a deeper frustration among many observers and the public alike. It reinforces the perception that even overwhelming evidence can be neutralized by privilege, procedural silence, and strategic redaction, and it keeps the conversation alive not just about who appears in the files, but why so much remains hidden. That sense of unfinished justice has become one of the defining emotions surrounding the release and continues to drive demands for greater accountability in how powerful figures are investigated and how information is shared with the public. At its core, this saga has become a broader reflection of how systems of power can adapt and endure even after a high-profile downfall. Institutions don't collapse simply because one figure is gone. They often consolidate, close ranks, and protect internal interests, leaving questionable practices intact for the next challenge. Epstein himself operated within a network of connections that did not disappear after his death or Maxwell's conviction, and evidence suggests that systems of influence continue to function in ways that frustrate those seeking full transparency and justice. In this context, it takes courage for individuals to step forward and speak out against entrenched norms, a quality seen in those like Mel Gibson and Mark Wahlberg, who publicly questioned aspects of the industry not because they sought greater fame, but because they believed something was wrong and refused to look away. When you ask whether they were right to question the culture around them, or whether these filings will ultimately lead to meaningful accountability, the more important question may be whether speaking the truth is still possible in a world that often rewards silence and obscurity. The history unfolding now is not just about one man's files or one case, but about how power, transparency, and accountability intersect in a society where many still feel justice has yet to be fully served.